Good morning and welcome again to La Civiltà Cattolica for this meeting organized together by Georgetown University and the review La Civiltà Cattolica about the culture of encounter in a divided world. I'm very glad to introduce you Father Arturo Sosa. I'm very glad and honored to host him here, also because, you know, Georgetown University and La Civiltà Cattolica are two Jesuit institutions, so we are very grateful for your presence and honored. So, you know already him, Father Sosa is the Superior General of the Society of Jesus. He was born in Caracas, Venezuela, and after being ordained a priest in 1977, Father Sosa became coordinator of the social apostolate of the province of Venezuela while serving as director of Gumilla Center. It's a social research and action center for the Jesuits in Venezuela. This role also included working in connection with the Jesuit networks of school called Fe y Alegría. Maybe some of you are already familiar with Fe y Alegría. He also engaged on the academic side as a lecturer. He earned a doctorate in political science in 1990, and probably you know that he attended the 33rd General Congregation of the Society of Jesus, in which he, at only 34 years of age, he was the youngest delegate, and there he met Father Jorge Mario Bergoglio. He was also present at the 34th General Congregation. Father Sosa served as Provincial Superior of the Society in Venezuela from 1996 to 2004, and at the end of his term as Provincial, he was assigned to the Catholic University of Táchira. In 2009, Father Nicolás, the previous general of the society, appointed him as a general counselor based in Venezuela, and in 2014, he joined the General Curia community by assuming the position of delegate for the interprovincial houses of the society in Rome. And on October the 13th, 2016, during the 36th General Congregation of the Society, the Assembly elected Father Sosa as the Order's 31st Superior General to succeed Father Adolfo Nicolás. So he became the first Latin American to head the Jesuits. For the second time, he was recently elected President of the Union of Superior Generals. Father Sosa, it's an honor for me to welcome you, and I give you the floor.
Good morning. You will notice very soon that my English accent is a Venezuelan one. I entitled this talk as Encounter as a Dimension of Cultures and a Path to Peace. The structural injustice characteristic of current socio-political relations appears to be a legacy that the preceding historical epoch is leaving to the new one that is beginning. During the pandemic that affect all of humanity and that reveal dearly the extent and the depth of the structural injustice, social gaps, poverty, forced migration, and other calamities continue to grow after the pandemic. It seems impossible to halt the environmental deterioration caused by the production models and lavish lifestyles inspired by the globalized consumerist capitalism. Armed conflicts continue and increase, even in places where it seemed that alternatives had been found for resolving conflicts. Global politics has failed to mature enough to govern the world in the common interest of humanity. For example, in this day we can ask ourselves, where is the United Nations in the process of peace between Russia and Ukraine? This global socio-political framework in which we move has already been referred to during the conference as an invaluable point of reference for the reflection I want to share with you this morning. I will share 4 points. The first one is cultures and multiculturalism. Making the encounter the essential and permanent dimension of the cultures in which we move is the heart of my reflections. I share with you on this occasion that it's important to understand encounter as a dimension, that not as a culture, no, as a dimension of every culture. That's, I think, is the real challenge. It's not a kind of a side culture. We have recalled how structural injustice generates situations of disagreement or discounter. The challenge of the mission we have received is to take effective steps towards fraternity and peace, developing the dimension of encounter within the cultures that give meaning to our life, becoming, therefore, an indispensable requirement for progress. Encounter is that dimension of cultures which serve as an instrument to help overcome injustice, transform society, and achieve reconciliation with persons, peoples, and the natural environment in which all life develops. I prefer to speak of cultures in the plural in order to highlight one of humanity's greatest riches, cultural diversity. Cultural diversity offers one of the most wonderful ways to participate in the creation that is born in God and His Word. Through their cultures, human beings are co-creators. Cultural diversity is to humanity what biodiversity is to nature. It is therefore a treasure that must be recognized, defended, conserved, and promoted. Through their cultures, individuals and peoples give meaning to and find meaning to their life. The Apostolic Constitutions Gaudium et Spes of Vatican II offer a clear description of what is meant by the word culture, because the word culture, we can understand many things, and we have many definitions of it. And looking for a good description of what I want to understand as culture, the best I found is that of the Gaudium et Spes. In the paper you will receive, or you have already received, I have a long quotation of the Gaudium et Spes, because I think it's a nice description of what cultures means. I only want to read 2 lines. This says, culture is everything whereby man develops and perfects his many bodily and spiritual qualities. We speak of a plurality of cultures. Different styles of life and multiple scales of values arise from the diverse manner of using things, of loving, of expressing oneself, of practicing religion, of forming custom, of establishing laws and juridical institutions, of cultivating the sciences that arts and beauty, the arts and beauty. It's very amazing how the Second Vatican Council was really opening their minds for giving this big, wide conception of a culture. The good news of Jesus Christ, is presented as a light for all human cultures. Jesus was born and lived in a certain culture, the part of the incarnation. Yet his gospel transcends all cultural boundaries. He and his disciples understood, not without difficulty, that the word of God is addressed to every human being and every human culture. The gospel can become incarnate in each and every human culture. Like the leaven that penetrates the dough, the gospel becomes embodied in cultures and opens them to the possibility of meeting with God, with others, and with nature. All cultures need this healing encounter to grow in humanity. That's what we say, in other words, or Paul said, the reconciliation of all things in Christ means that the cultures are really enlightened by the gospel. Cultures are the fruit of the exercise of human freedom. Human beings freely establish relationships by which they seek to give meaning to existence, to their daily personal and social life. Cultural relations are born of the human need first to bestow and share meaning on life in common ideals, values, attitudes, etc. Second, to establish ways of producing, distributing, and consuming the material goods necessary for the life, what we call economic relations. And third, to make decisions about the destiny and governance of civil society, what we call political relations. Religions are an important part of the ideas, symbols, and meanings given to the life of human groups through culture. Human relationships are therefore historical, dynamic, and ever-changing. Cultures are on the move. They do not exist by themselves. Now, so they form part of a kind of social genetics that is transmitted and changed from one generation to another. Culture is at once personal and shared. Each person, unique and unrepeatable, takes on an identity through culture. At the same time, culture bestows on individuals an identity that is socially shared with other human beings, each of them also unique and unrepeatable. In today's world, multicultural experiences and spaces exist in tension with the trend that favors cultural homogeneity, a trend that is promoted because it supports market dynamics, the dominant structure of relations of production and consumption. Multiculturalism recognizes cultural diversity as human richness. It favors coexistence among different cultures, and it promotes their preservation. Multiculturalism is a complex and fruitful experience of encounter between culturally diverse human beings. At the same time, it reflects the inevitable tension between the local roots of each human being or social group and the universal vision that generates global identity and universal citizenship. I move to my second point, encountering humanity through interculturality. The mission we have received of working for the reconciliation of all things in Christ prevents us from being satisfied with multiculturalism. It confronts us with the challenge of interculturality, which leads to an enriching exchange among all peoples and social groups that meet together and share their cultures. The constant increase of migratory flows in the world reveals the deep wounds that exist, but it also offers the opportunity for cultural exchange on a large scale. We can see in this reality
and important signs of the times that call us to deepen the dimension of encounter. This is a path that leads us to feel that we are members of all humanity. We are true citizens of the world. Inculturation is the first stage of this path, and it requires an encounter with one's own culture that produces critical awareness. The second stage is what we have called multiculturalism. This consists in experience of and joyous encounter with other human beings and their cultures, and being able to happily share with them a life in peace. Interculturality is a still further stage, one that requires a deeper and más complex encounter. It involves relating to other human beings and their cultures, sharing with them the value of one's own critically examined culture, and being enriched by the contribution of cultural diversity. Intercultural encounter, thus, becomes a driving force towards social justice, fraternity, and peace. Intercultural encounter goes beyond what we have called multiculturalism. The latter recognize the existence of many cultures through human history and across the wide geography where peoples have lived, and it fosters peaceful coexistence among them. Intercultural encounter seeks to build bridges and promote fluid exchange among all cultures in a complex process that involves confirming and enriching one's own identity, while also enriching the identity of others. Encounter always runs the risk of provoking conflicts. This process is impossible not to come to some conflicts, because that is the part of our way of encountering ourselves. In Spanish we say encuentro y encontronazo. Can happen. Interculturally is not just an encounter between cultures that avoids the need to acquire a critical view of one's own culture, nor does it allow one to satisfy with a simple respect for cultural diversity, as it were somehow possible to produce a metacultural or supracultural sphere or space. We encourage encounter among people from different cultures as a means of cultural enrichment. Interculturality enriches those who engage in the process, and it is possible to achieve because all cultures have the dimension of the encounter. Intercultural encounter is a reciprocal exchange between cultures that leads to the transformation and enrichment of those involved. It is therefore a participatory interactive encounter with the historical, social, economic, and political context in which it unfolds. Through intercultural encounter, cultures develop more dynamically, undergoing internal changes and lead them to grow in the universal dimension of humanity. My third point, I call it encounter at the breaking of bread. In Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis described the encounter of the Samaritan with the wounded man abandoned on the road to show how fraternity is created. The Samaritan is not snared in a way of living his culture that prevents him from reaching out to encounter the person who needs his help. On the contrary, the dimension of encounter opens his eyes to human needs without making distinctions. The cultural dimension of encounter makes it possible to care for other wounded persons, people, and cultures. It makes it possible to embrace them and offer every means to heal wounds build bridges, and foster fraternity. Another scene from the Gospel of Luke can help us understand encounters as a dimension of our human cultures and search of a just and fraternal world. The history is well known. Having experienced the crucifixion of Jesus as a failure, two disciples feel disillusioned and want to return to Emmaus and their previous life. The teacher, in whom they had placed all their messianic hope, was sentenced to death. The scandal of the cross provokes in them a disencounter. And a scandal, say Paul. While they are on their way, mulling over the disappointment, Jesus, the resurrected one, who is the crucified one, goes forward to meet them. He engaged them in a conversation that leads them to invite him to share a meal, during which they recognize him in the breaking of the bread. With great haste, they returned to an encounter with the companions who had remained in Jerusalem. The so-called disciples of Emmaus had been following Jesus of Nazareth while still trapped in the fixed views of their cultures. Since they had not achieved a critical vision of their own culture, they could not truly encounter the teacher, whose message did not fit into the cultural categories that they had given meaning to their life. Those categories interpreted the arrest, passion, and death of Jesus as a complete failure of the mission to liberate Israel. As a result, unable to comprehend, they returned to the life they had always led. Jesus takes the initiative. He begins by walking alongside the disillusioned disciples. For a good while, he accompanies them and listens attentively to their story. He is trying to build bridges with the disciples and understand the cultural categories by which they interpreted what happened. This is the dynamic of enculturation to which I referred above. Jesus creates the conditions that will enrich the vision and the sensibility of the disciples. Using the disciples' own language and their cultural categories, Jesus proposes another way of understanding what happened. He does this by sharing his own experience of the events, using fresh cultural categories that throw new light on the experience of his disciples. What then takes place is what we call intercultural encounter. Not content with the rational discourse, put into comprehensive words, Jesus has provoked a personal encounter. That is why the disciples urge him to stay with them. They feel enriched by this experience and want Jesus to share their home and their table. Finally, they cross the bridge that Jesus has built, and they open themselves to the encounter. They recognize him in the breaking of the bread. Intercultural encounter has brought about deep communication in these human beings who were previously limited in their understanding of the reality by cultural categories that had not yet incorporated the dimension of encounter. Intercultural communion makes that encounter contagious. The disciple cannot remain calmly in their home around the table by themselves. They must go forth to encounter others and share the new light they receive from their encounter with Jesus. The road to Emmaus is a round trip, back and forth, across the bridge built on the foundation of the dimension of intercultural encounter that enriches and transforms. And my fourth and last point, guiding our steps along the path of peace. The longing for peace has been present in human cultures throughout a long history filled with violence and wars. Now, in the midst of a piecemeal Third World War, as Pope Francis described it, we aspire to a lasting peace that goes beyond the silence of arms. Peace is founded on social justice. As long as there is no transformation of the socioeconomic structure that generates poverty and sustains the scandalous difference between some peoples and others, between a few very rich people and a poor majorities, and as long as religious fundamentalisms, justifications, and smokescreens in ideology do not disappear, violence will not end, nor will the flow of forced migrations and the trafficking of people be diminished. The aggression against the natural environment will not cease either, even through the threatening life of a planet Earth. The permanent presence of the Lord in history is aimed at guiding the step of humanity along the path of peace through human encounters that gladly accept diversity, appreciate freedom, encourage dialogue, and build fraternity. Peace requires walking together along the complex path of reconciliation that leads us from tragic disencounter and fractured human relations toward genuine fraternal encounter. Peace requires walking together in the same direction in order to create the conditions for dialogue. It involves accompanying personal and group processes that are both complex in nature and asynchronous. That is, that they advance at different rates and can be harmonized only by the patient and conditional presence of those who accompany them. Intercultural encounter is possible when there is a collaboration among many people, not only from diverse cultures, but also of different characteristics and complementary capacities. Collaboration involves sharing responsibility for the processes and is therefore an indispensable condition for intercultural encounter. Engaging in intercultural encounter means increasing and refining the capacity for dialogue, a key dimension of the process. Dialogue should be intercultural and at the same time intracultural. As we have tried to explain above, the resistance and the obstacles will be clear to all. Intercultural encounter occurs in the sphere of politics, that is, in those social relations by which human groups define their raison d'etre, their objective, and the means they use to achieve them. In recent months, the media have repeated like parrots the false statement that war is politics by other means. Rather, war replaces politics with violence and force of arms. War is the discontinuity of politics, even worse. It is a renunciation of politics that takes us in the opposite direction from the goal of peace. Intercultural encounter take place in the midst of conflicts of all kinds. It is impossible to imagine intracultural or intercultural political processes without conflict, as I said before. The path toward justice and peace through intercultural encounter is a complex process of reconciliation among human beings, and its culmination is forgiveness, without which peace lacks of solid foundations. I want to underline this because it's a core concept of the Christian message, forgiveness. And we don't talk about, we don't hear about, we don't listen that word very often in any conflict.
without forgiveness, without mercy, it's impossible to arrive to peace through reconciliation. The reconciliation that leads to social justice includes reestablishing an harmonious relationship with nature and the entire environment in which life develops. True peace is the reconciliation of all things in Christ, the final goal of the intercultural encounter and the possibility we have having encounter as a dimension of our cultures. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Father Sosa. Now I have the honor to open the floor for the discussion. Please, if you have questions, we have the opportunity to put directly to Father Sosa. So, Jose Casanova, please.
Dear Father Sosa, thank you so much for this truly insightful reflection on multiculturalism, interculturality, cultural communion accompanying people on the road, and the socio-structural conditions for just peace. All reflections which are so deeply ingrained in the historical experience of the Society of Jesus from its foundation till the present. So thank you. My question is about another problem that we have today throughout the world, which is not so much the intercultural, but the intracultural conflicts, what you've called the encontronazos, the confrontations within cultures, within religions, within nations. We know this, I know this from my own country, Spain, from the United States where I live, and certainly you know from your own country, Venezuela, the problem of the encontronazos within society. So how do we, because today sometimes it's easier for us to encounter the other religion, the other culture, the other people, than our own. So I want you to reflect on the difficulties and the polarization that we find within each of our societies, within each of our religions. We know within Catholicism the confrontations that we find for all kinds of reasons. So I want you to help us reflect on what can we do. I'm sure you've reflected a lot upon the fair of encounter within Venezuelan society. So please, if you could give us some insights.
Yes, I think this is what the gospel, the good news, give to us is the possibility of overcome that dynamic of encontronazo. No? That's what the gospel give to our cultures. So, but the encounter with the gospel means a conversion. So it means a personal and a communal transformation. You need really to change, to become in the possibility of being in dialogue with other culture and with your own culture. So I want to underline again that the conversion is of our own culture. We need to have to acquire a critical view of our culture, so we can go. That means to renounce. No, it's to convert, because every culture has a lot of values, a lot of human substance there. But if the culture becomes a way of getting us blind about the reality, that yes blocks the possibility of dialogue.
when I can see my culture with the gospel's view, when I can convert, I can also really, how do you say that? Really to understand that I have a value, a richness in my own culture that I can give to others. Because the encounter is to give. And what I give is what I am. No, if I really am able to know what I am, I can give something to the other. That's in the process of dialogue, the first step for me is to give what I am and to receive what the others are. So, in theological terms, is the difference between redemption and sin. No, if we are in the sin mode, we cannot see others or see ourselves as able to transform ourselves. If we accept the redemption, we go beyond our limits. In political language, I think making a very simple and of a complex reality, but for example, the conflict between authoritarianism and democracy is there. So authoritarianism needs to close the cultures themselves and becomes a kind of fundamentalism, religious or ideological or whatever, and close the group in their own interest. And they see the others as non-human, so they can fight to them. No? They can kill them. Democracy begins to accept the differences and plurality, and to accept the other people as human beings with the same rights. No? All we are citizens, and we can participate in a process of making decisions. And these two poles are now in our everyday history, almost in every country in the world. No? And that's why it's so important to have a real political engagement, so we can really provoke intercultural dialogue and encounter.
So, thank you. Okay, there is another question, Cristina Gomez.
Thank you, Reverend Sosa. I really love the fact that you brought up the idea of forgiveness as something to be considered. And I know that it's such a loaded concept, and ideally, it's a beautiful thing. But how does it look like in practical terms? And I know one of the problems with forgiveness is, that the party that forgives will be seen as looking weak, and it opens up to further abuse and violence. So I'd just like to hear more about your ideas on forgiveness in this context of culture of encounter.
You are asking for practical terms, and that's not easy. No, so I will refer to my own experience in my Jesuit life. No? As you heard before, I am from the Venezuelan province of the Society of Jesus. When the Society of Jesus came to Venezuela in 1916, 100 years ago only. So when I joined the Society of Jesus, most of the, more or less 80% or more of the Jesuits of the province, around 250 Jesuits, were from Spain, from different parts of Spain, and only a few of us were Venezuelan. So that was a first challenge to really, and what is nice in my experience is those coming from Spain, they really took seriously what inculturation means. So all of them, or majority of them, really try to understand what was happening in Venezuela, what was the Venezuelan culture, and how to deal with that. And we need to understand also their culture, we Venezuelans, to really make part of the same community. In that time, we used to talk about, again in Spanish, venezolanización, for everyone, not only for those who came from other countries, but for us, for our Venezuelan board, because also when you get in a level of conscience, you realize that you don't know your reality, that you need also to go deeper in your own culture, so you can establish a real dialogue. So that was my first years of experience in the Society of Jesus. And then I came to study theology here in Rome, in a big community of more than 70 Jesuits of around 30 different countries. Was another way of, we are all young people, more or less about 25 years old, 25, 30 years old, from very different, all the continents, no? And it was another nice experience of how to understand different realities and to make a common purpose, no? And then Antonio mentioned that I was participating in the 33rd General Congregation, 1983. Was for me a real multicultural experience. And so on. I don't want to, because I have a lot of time in society, not too many years. So, but my point is, the Society of Jesus in my history has come from missionaries coming from Europe and North America to all the world, to a multicultural body. So now the Society of Jesus is a real multicultural body, amazing. And we can more or less live in peace among us, with the normal conflicts of a group. But I think we are just starting the experience of interculturality. So we cannot remain like this. We need to really take advantage of these multiculturalisms in the body of the society, so we can really have intercultural communities everywhere. So that really, because when you go deeper in knowing each other, you know that even in the same country you have so many cultures. And so how to really get in a wider dialogue and exchange of values, and those values converge in what we call Christian life. It's human life, no? Human life, that means reconciliation, peace, and all what they say. So this, I think, is for the next few years for us as Jesuits, the challenge of interculturality is the biggest challenge, to really become an intercultural body. So really we can witness in this world that the encounter of the culture is possible, and that is a path to peace.
Thank you. We have again one question. Yes, thank you. From India.
Thank you very much for that inspiring reflection that you have given. Like Christine, I also like to get a little more reflection from you with regard to peace, building peace through creating a culture of encounter. But we all know that peace cannot be established without, it has to be based on justice. On the other hand, we also say peace through forgiveness and reconciliation. When I look at the two concrete places right now, one is the Palestinian issue. Decades they are suffering human right violations on the Palestinians from the Israeli forces. We are all aware of it. They had been talking about catastrophe, Nakba, And therefore, how do we bring about peace in situations like this, where one group has been always victimized, terribly victimized beyond human description, continue to be victimized, and yet they are longing for peace and reconciliation. And then we know the recent conflict, the aggression of Russian on Ukrainian situation. I don't have to explain. Again, if Ukrainian people have to reconcile with the Russians, where is peace without justice? And I know it is not an easy situation to reflect on, but if the Spirit is inspiring you right now about some of this, how do we hold justice, peace, reconciliation, and forgiveness together as a Christian?
Easy question. It's real a struggle, but my only answer to that is to contemplate the cross of Christ. And that's why I mentioned the Emmaus disciples in my talk, because it's very difficult to understand the cross as not a failure but a succeed. No, it's very, and that happens in our ordinary life. No, now victims wants to take a revenge of the victimizers, or those who are invaded, they want to. So that dynamic do not goes to justice, goes to revenge, and revenge is not justice. And justice is not the justice is not understood in the sense of the law. No, that the law is very, very limited. That's why the cross is a kind of sign of forgiveness. It's the way to break the dynamic, no, of giving to hit each other. No, you hit me, I hit you. No, ojo por ojo, diente por diente. To break that, how to break that, and that's why we in our language of Christian language, you say to give your life. It's not a joke. To give the life is not a joke. It's really to give the life. No, and that's what Jesus showed us, and that's the way to life. No, it's the way to the real life. Because forgiveness and peace are only possible is founded in love. No, that is, forgiveness is not a kind of I don't know, a kind of because you are so bad, I just don't see you. No, it's love. Forgiveness founded in love. Love should be so big that you can forgive. And reconciliation is impossible without love. And peace is impossible without love. And that's why we have to contemplate the cross all the time.
We have one more question. Two more questions. We can collect them. Okay.
Bohumil Petrik, I'm a Slovak journalist here in Rome. And my question is that the Jesuit order is one of the greatest orders in the world, one of, well, many saints. It has done a lot of good. Yet at the same time, since one of your predecessors, Padre Erupe, there has been an internal struggle about how, to what extent adapt to the world, or rather to the contrary, to let it be adapted to the gospel. And this is where my question starts, because there's been a lot of criticism. I just want you to answer part of it, like whether a current Jesuit order, especially in both Americas actually, has not been adapted to the world. In other words, whether the culture of Encanto for the current leadership means submission and adaptation to the world, rather than having the world adapted to the gospel. I mean, the embracing of various dangerous or at least controversial theories, wokeness, BLM, critical race theory by really leaders of Jesuit orders, or as I said, in some, at least, countries of both Americas, whether this is not just the culture of encounter, but rather, as I said, a kind of retreat from your identity, values, and so on and so forth. So just your thoughts about this.
I'm not sure if I got your question, but if I understand that how my message is that we don't need a culture of encounter, but the encounter to become a dimension of every culture. So a culture of encounter can be something like outside us. So something we learn, you know, we change our cap. I think that the real challenge is how encounter becomes a dimension of every culture, because every culture has the temptation of enclose in the self and to defend and to understand everything from that categories of that culture. If the dimension of encounter is incorporated in a culture that can opens and understand that these are relative values that can be in touch with other values and can be enriched by other values and also can be given to others. So opens, and that's the tension, I think, in every culture. No, it's not an addition, but is how make possible that the encounter becomes the dimension of every culture.
We have another question here.
Father Sosa, thank you for. My name is Mario Marazziti. Thank you for your beautiful Spanish English, because I understood everything. And the second, because you shared with us part of the heart of Jesus. And this is something we need in this time of pain. And I want to highlight what you said, that we have to accompany the desire of peace. And this is particularly true in a time when weapons are speaking. And I myself lived the experience for Sant'Egidio, because I was trying in the first year of war to stop the escalation of the Syrian war. And at that time we had put 72 sides of political opponents to Assad that did not want the military solution, but a political dialogue. But the American administration and other administrations were saying, Assad must go away first. That was impossible, it was nonsense. Because there was Russia, it is Russia now, and so on. So there is a prerequisite for peace, that is that someone must win before peace. And this made everything impossible. We are with 10 million displaced people, and so on, and so on, and so on. But we have to work on this in a time in which something is broken. 40 years ago, to say that war can be a normal way to solve the conflicts would have been heretic. Now it seems normal. And you mentioned that there is the fake that war is political in another way. It is the opposite. Now, how can we work to rebuild a little piece of truth and at the same time to accompany and to start dialogue while weapons are speaking and not after that? If you can, I think we have a responsibility to try to open a breakthrough in the ruling classes about that, and also as Christians. And I'm very inspired by what you say, because I can feel we are on the same page, but we do not have the answer. So how can we?
Again, it's another easy question. From my point of view, we have to be more courageous to really work politically. So without a good political formation for everybody, it's impossible to arrive to another kind of, because war and violence is an instinctive reaction for everything, personally or groups or cultures or nations. And it's a dynamic that is very, very spontaneous. Politics needs a real change in the persons and in the nations, no? Because politics means being able to have common goals that comes from the dialogue among different goals. In particular, that also from the ancient Greeks, no? The difference between a citizen and an idiot. No, the citizen is the one who is able to understand that our interests bigger than theirs, than his own interest. How to create the environment, the social environment, where everyone is able to understand that the common good is better than my particular interest or the group of my group. And that to become citizen. And I think we are going back in that in our present world. We are going not forward to be more citizens, but we are going back in being more thrive or something similar. So I think it's a real, what can we do to start being citizen and to form citizenship? No, without citizenship, it's impossible to go to the dialogue and to the reconciliation and to peace. No, it's only the way to reinforce a violent, call whatever you want to call it, a reaction to every other conflict.
Thank you. Unfortunately, the time is over, but thank you, Father Sosa, for honoring our conference with your participation and with your inspiring speech. Thank you so much.